Dr. Gary Coles is an acupuncturist and a naturopath. He's lived in West Michigan since 1977 with his wife, Judy, who's here today, and Eric. He's been a Baha'i since 1970, and he lives in Ludington. So today he's going to speak about the life of the Bab and the day of his martyrdom. Also, I may add that after his presentation, there are 2 additional segments. Please sit tight, do not leave your seats. We're not done after the presentation. Dr. Coles.
Thank you, Ramin. Is the sound working? Thank you. Ramin has already spoken about some of the early years of the Bab and his early years of his mission. The number of people who joined the Baha'i faith was in the thousands. The area was highly corrupt and very severely divided between people in power and people in poverty. And in many cases, justice was not carried out. Things were carried out as a matter of convenience for the rich and powerful. So in that setting, the Bab talked about social justice and aimed his focus on the rights and dignity of the poor. In addition to that, dignitaries in those cities found themselves drawn to the Bab regardless of their position and became Babis and subsequently had to give up their land, their position, their money, their power, and they did it anyway. When the opposition found themselves in a position to be able to write warrants for his death, they proceeded with haste because it seemed to be an opportunity to end all of that. So with the proper documentation, at noon, they led the Bab and his disciple to the square in front of the citadel of Tabriz. Sam Khan, the commander of the Armenian regiment, was detailed to execute them, and he was ill at ease, to say the least. The prisoner looked kind and compassionate. For what crime was he to be put to death? Unable to still the voice of his conscience, Sam Khan went to the Bab directly, and he said, I profess the Christian faith and entertain no ill will against you. If your cause is to be the cause of truth, enable me to free myself from the obligation to shed your blood. To this the Bab replied, follow your instructions. And if your intention is sincere, the Almighty will surely be able to relieve you from your perplexity. The Bab and his disciple were suspended by ropes from a nail in the wall, and the head of Mirza Muhammad Ali, his disciple, was resting on his chest. 750 soldiers were positioned in 3 lines. The roofs of the buildings around them were teamed with spectators. Each row of soldiers fired in turn. The smoke was so loud and clean, the smoke was so, it's a misquote in the writing, the smoke was so thick from many rifles, it clouded the scene. When it lifted, the Bab was not there. Only his disciple could be seen standing under the nail in the wall, smiling and unconcerned. The bullets had only severed the ropes with which they were suspended. The cries came out from the onlookers, the Bab has gone out of sight, and a frantic search followed. The Bab was found sitting in the same room where he had been lodged the night before, in a conversation with his secretary. That conversation had been interrupted earlier in the day, and now it was finished, and he told the officer to carry out his duty. The officer was terror-stricken and ran away, nor did he ever return to his post. Sam Khan, for his part, told his superiors that he had already carried out the task given to him, and he would not attempt it for a second time. So a gentleman named Akajan Khan-i-Kamshi, a regiment of not Armenians, and the Bab and his disciple were suspended once again at the same spot. At this time, the Bab addressed the multitude gathered to see him die. He said, If you believed in me, O wayward generation, every one of you would have followed the same example of this youth and would have sacrificed himself in my path. The day will come when you will have recognized me, and that day shall have ceased to be with you. Thus, at noon, one midsummer night, Sunday, July 9th, 1850, he was put to death, a manifestation of God, just as it was at noon, centuries before, with Jesus Christ, another manifestation of God. When night fell, they dragged the bodies through the seats of Tabriz and threw them to the edge of a moat surrounding the city. The soldiers were standing there to guard over them, lest the Babis attempt to retrieve the precious remains. Not far away, two Babis, pretending madness, kept vigil throughout the night. The next morning, the Russian consul took an artist with them to make a drawing of the remains of the Bab. Suleiman Khan, a loyal disciple who attained the presence of the Bab, reached Tabriz the day after his martyrdom. He had intended to rescue his master, but that was not to be. Now he went straight away to Tabriz and visited a friend of long standing who told him that he had decided to dare everything that very night and carry the bodies away by the surprise attack on the soldiers guarding the edge of the moat. He told Suleiman Khan to withdraw for a moment and assured him that there was a much safer and more reliable way to achieve his purpose. I'll tell you an indirect story about that in a second. There was in Tabriz another individual, a confidant, well known for his exploits, and he influenced the officials and used such means as he could to best take the bodies away from the eyes of the soldiers. He delivered the remains to Suleiman Khan, who had them moved to a silk factory of Haji Muhammad, a Baha'i, in Milan. There they were enshrouded and hidden under bales of silk. Next day, the casket was made to contain them, and they were sent away to safety. Haji Aliyar refused to accept any reward for his service. The soldiers reported the disappearance of the bodies. Wild beasts must have devoured their remains, they alleged, while they slept. And the officials gave credence to that story and shouted for joy and dismissed their story. What better proof could there be to show how false the Bab was? Beasts do not and cannot consume the remains of a messenger. Fortunately, there's more on the subject about what happened after the remains of the Bab had been thrown in a ditch. These are gathered from the notes of a pilgrim who attended Haifa in 1909 when Abdul Baha was present in the Holy Land. Quote, "In a state that is often characterized in Baha'i history, the people who harmed the Bab's faith came to a sorry end themselves. The officers of the regiment who carried out the execution, together with a third of its soldiers, died in an earthquake the same year. So 1/3 of the battalion was already gone within a year. A wall had collapsed on top of them because of that earthquake. The other 2/3, in a faithful second regiment, they were all executed in front of a firing squad in Tabriz in a manner just like the Bab himself, after they had a failed attempt at mutiny a few years later. Interestingly, the details surrounding the execution are well documented in an official report of a military officer who watched the events. The night of execution, the mangled remains of the two victims were taken outside the city gates and dumped in a moat where they were supposed to be eaten by wild animals. To prevent the Babis removing the bodies and giving them a dignified burial, a total of 40 soldiers kept watch by the bodies outside the city. But one of the Babis, Haji Suleiman Khan, who was staying with the local mayor, was so determined to rescue the bodies at the risk of his life that the mayor enlisted one of his assistants for the job instead. In the middle of the night, the mayor's assistant took the bodies under the guards' noses while they slept and laid them in a specially made wooden casket in a safe hiding place nearby. Later, when Baha'u'llah heard about this development, he instructed Ali Suleiman Khan to bring the bodies to a local shrine in Tehran where they were hidden. From then on, the Bab's remains had to be kept a close secret to keep them out of the hands of the faith's enemies. Whenever danger threatened or the word got out about their whereabouts, Baha'u'llah, or later Abdul-Baha, would have the casket moved to a new location. It was a full 60 years before the Bab's body was finally laid to rest. In that time, the bodies were moved around over a dozen hiding places, under the floorboards of a shrine, between the walls of an abandoned temple, and concealed within various Baha'i houses, a secret kept even from the Baha'i community, until at last they were laid to proper rest in Haifa in 1909 by a tearful Abdul-Baha. Abdul-Baha pictured a string of terraced gardens leading up the garden to a shrine for the Bab and beyond to the mountaintop. Just under 50 years ago, Shoghi Effendi, his grandson, finished building the Golden Dome shrine that now houses the Bab's remains, and in May 2014, after 10 years of work, the terraced gardens were finished. Again, from the notes of a person in the pilgrimage at Holy Land in 1909, we learn the following, another story. One of the greatest privileges we had during our visit was to be present when the ashes of the Bab were finally moved to their resting place on Mount Carmel in Haifa. It is beyond me to depict the beauty and solemnity of that scene. Abdul-Baha was indescribably grand. We saw him for the first time without his headdress, his fez. His beautiful white hair falling about his shoulders, he had thrown off his dark outer garment and was robed in a flowing garment of neutral blue. When the sarcophagus was finally placed in position, Abdul-Baha was an image never to be forgotten. One of the believers held aloft a lamp, the light of which fell like a radiance upon his form as he stood next to the sarcophagus. With tears streaming down his face, he changed the sacred ashes with his own hands. Ashes which had been held in a casket many, many years, into the magnificent white marble sarcophagus, which was a loving gift from the Baha'is of India. When the marble cover was placed, Abdul-Baha threw himself on the sarcophagus and wept aloud in a manner that brought all those present to weep with him. Such a tumult of thoughts and emotions surged through our minds, for it seemed as if all the miraculous happenings of this faith, from its earliest dawn to the present, just passed before our vision, flooding our souls with awe and wonder at the mighty works of God. The expression he had on his face as he walked out of the shrine was so intense that we stood petrified until he passed into another part of the building where a room was prepared for him to rest. In the meantime, the believers who had been working with him came out and stood in groups, speaking together in hushed tones while they awaited to accompany Abdul-Baha to the city of Haifa. Within days, one Baha'i had given up his business, and for a while he and his family camped near the location of the tomb for some weeks. And during this time, he alone quietly worked with pick and shovel to create a hole in the structure of the shrine area through which the sarcophagus could finally be passed. They could not employ skilled laborers at this time for fear of drawing attention to mischief makers. Before we left that afternoon, Mother and I had the privilege of drinking a cup of tea with Abdul-Baha, but as he was greatly fatigued, we soon excused ourselves and descended the mountainside with full hearts. This is a letter of May Woodcock to A.M. Bryan in 1909. That being said, our Peace Park here is not merely a piece of property with events being conducted. Its origins were made with great sacrifice, and unique events transpired where Abdul-Baha and Shoghi Effendi and the National Spiritual Assembly and the Universal House of Justice in succession said, do not sell the property. This happened even when there was a need in the funds and financial situations were taxing on everyone, and the sale of the property might have helped. And still the answer was no. The adjacent properties to the original property have been added slowly, one at a time, and almost without exception, they have been dedicated and commemorated to members of people's families, Baha'is in Iran, who have been executed for no other reason than their choice of faith. So with that in mind, I would have to say that we're all standing on hallowed ground. That's my feeling. I've had that feeling since the first day I saw this place. Now it's confirmed. Thank you.